Loving Father, we're thankful for your many blessings to us, the opportunity we have to learn. I pray that you will open our minds. Help us to be discerning about the things that we hear and that we see. Help us to rightly divide the word of truth. Help us always to serve Jesus in his name. Okay, this is the fifth in our series. And Christine Maggiore was diagnosed 12 years ago, HIV positive, just out of the blue, she'll tell you. And did the standard thing. At that time, they weren't hitting people immediately with drugs, and didn't take drugs. And in the next few years, questions began to arise. And the title that I gave to this is Just Relax, It's Information. Okay? Listen carefully, ask questions. That's exactly what our organization is set up to do, to stimulate questions and to answer questions and to encourage people to ask questions and to get more information. So we'll now hear from Christine Maggiore. The record sheet is there.
I assume that's not for me.
No.
Okay. Well, thank you for being here, but I guess you have to be because this is your class. So, yeah. Well, thanks for listening. I appreciate that. As Professor Agard said, I tested positive in 1992. It was during a routine medical exam, and it was quite a shock to me as I had no risk factors, no particular concerns, no illnesses. I just took the test really at the badgering of the doctor who said it was the responsible thing to do in today's world, and I wanted to be a good citizen and be responsible. I was absolutely devastated when the results came back positive because I thought I had made a really great life for myself. I had a business that was very successful, an import-export business that was doing several $1 million a year. I just bought a home as a single person. I had a couple of cars. I was giving money to charities. I'd applied to become a big sister in my efforts to be responsible and give something back to the world. And my life came to a crashing and very devastating halt. I felt very ashamed of myself, and the thought of ever standing in public and mentioning to anyone what happened to me was the furthest thing from my mind. But as I was given 5 to 7 years to live at that time, I thought probably the best thing I could do with that short amount of time was to use myself as an example to warn other people of what could happen to them. So I became involved as a public speaker and an educator for several prominent AIDS organizations, AIDS Project Los Angeles, which is a big one, LA Shanti Foundation. I think it originated up here in San Francisco area. And I was also elected to the founding board of an organization called Women at Risk. And what I did mostly was go out and speak to groups of students and adults about the things that we normally hear about when it comes to HIV and AIDS, that the tests are very important and they're very accurate, that it's the responsible thing to do to take them and to find out what your status is, that the drugs can extend your life, and that everything that we hear in the media and from AIDS organizations all makes sense and is correct and true and adds up. And when I was out speaking about that stuff, I believed it with all my heart. I believed I was doing a good and important thing with my remaining time in telling people and sharing people, also on a personal level. If it could happen to me, it could happen to you. At the same time, I noticed that there weren't very many people like me in any of these organizations. Most of the people in the support groups were former IV drug users, or they'd tested positive because of a blood transfusion somewhere along the line. Very few people were Caucasian. Many of them didn't speak English. I was oftentimes the only one that was employed. And that made me kind of stand out in these organizations and made me popular. That I'd never used IV drugs was a big point too. And so I became very busy and active, more than I ever intended to be, because there was such demand for my services. And at the same time I was doing this, I was looking for a doctor that I could die with. I wanted somebody who would know me by name when I walked in the door, who wouldn't have to look at my chart before they said hello, who would speak as well as listen, who hopefully had a good sense of humor, current magazines in the waiting room, comfortable couches, and that I would like, because I figured the process of that dying is something you want to go through with somebody with whom you have a connection. So a year or so into this public service and the search for my ideal doctor, I finally met a doctor who I clicked with, and she just spun my world. She said, "I think you should take the test again. You don't fit the profile of an AIDS patient." And I thought, well, gosh, that seems like a little glimmer of hope, but how realistic is that hope? And yeah, I am different, and I've noticed that these AIDS organizations always want to put me forward and center because I do seem to be different from the average person involved on this level. But, the thought that it could all be a mistake perhaps, and that my life might be my own again, and I didn't have this clock ticking over my head was a bit daunting. And so for months, I didn't have the courage to go out and take that test. I'd already met people in the organizations, many who died during the time I was working there. In fact, when I was at Women at Risk, on the 2 years that I served on their board, every single woman on the board and involved with the organization died. All of those that were on the treatment drugs, that is. There were 3 of us who weren't taking them, and we all are still alive and well today. I noticed that the guy who interviewed me and brought me into the Speakers Bureau at AIDS Project Los Angeles, when I went in for my pre-interview, we spoke with each other. He also tested positive and had the same T-cell count as I did, which is supposed to be a very precise measure of your immune function. He decided to go on drug therapies, and he died before I graduated. It was very disturbing. So to think that somehow I might be spared that fate, why me? I was afraid to test. Then one day I was at the gym and I met this guy who was really cute and nice and funny, and he sort of indicated he wanted to go out, and I figured, well, I got to tell him this. When I did, he said, well, why don't you go retest? Geez, I'll take you out to lunch after. So all it took was a cute guy and an offer for a free lunch, and I went in and took the test again. And, lightheartedly, but at the same time, it meant everything. It meant, life or death, dating, not dating, being, around for years to come and enjoying what I had created so far in my life or not. And so I pinned a lot of hopes on this test, and my results came back indeterminate. That meant I was in HIV limbo. I wasn't positive enough to be positive, and I wasn't negative enough to be negative, which was a total jip because I thought I would be told one way or the other definitively what was going on. So it was recommended that I take a test that at that time I was told and I believed could actually tell me if the virus was there, because these were antibody tests that measure your antibody response and let you know if supposedly you've been exposed because your body's produced antibodies. So this test was said to be more accurate and could get to the real deal. Did I have the actual virus? And I thought, why didn't I do this in the first place? Why did I have to wait all these years? So I took this test and it came back positive, and I was devastated again. Why did I get my hopes up? And then I got a call from a journalist who'd heard about what I was going through and said, that test you took, it doesn't really test for the virus. Did you know that? Did you know the antibody test can't really tell you if you're infected? They don't even measure specific antibody response to HIV. So what are you talking about? Here I am, the public speaker, the educator on the board of Women at Risk. If there was information like this, I would probably know about it because, I was up there in the, higher echelons of the AIDS PR world. And I didn't believe him. And he told me about a professor of molecular and cell biology at UC Berkeley who came and spoke with you guys who had substantiation for the things he was saying and more, that this professor challenged the very idea that HIV was the cause of AIDS, which sounded ridiculous to me, having seen what I'd seen and having learned what I learned. But when I took a test again, because I thought, well, maybe this guy's right. Maybe this test really can't tell me if the virus is there. I'm going to take another antibody test and see what the antibody response is now that I know for sure the virus is there, supposedly. So I took the antibody test again, negative. And then I took it one more time a few months later, and it was positive again. And I thought, okay, what is going on here? And I decided to investigate the information that the journalist had told me about. And frankly, friends had told me about years before, but it just didn't seem, tenable that there could be, in, this very black and white world of HIV and AIDS, a gray area that I wasn't exposed to at any point. So I looked into that gray area, and all of a sudden, it's like everything came into focus. It became more black and white, and I understood a lot of things I hadn't understood before, like why it was that from 1985 until 1990, I had a boyfriend. And I hadn't had any relationship with anyone since. So in '92, when I tested positive, he was the logical person to call with the great news. So I called him up and we spoke, and by then he was married with 2 kids. And all this, the tension around this was tremendous. He went in and tested and came up positive, and then he had to confront his wife about the family and all that. Wife and kids negative. He couldn't find anyone in his past that had tested positive. I couldn't find anyone in mine. You know, we were kind of blaming each other, but you know, where the heck did it come from for either of us? If I didn't get it from him, as we're told, you always get it from somewhere or somebody, you know, how long have I been positive? 20 years? I mean, it was really weird. And I was also told that I had a new infection because my T cell count was so high after I tested positive, and that was supposed to be a measure of my health. So I was supposedly had this new infection. There was nothing new in my life. The person who supposedly gave it to me, his wife and kids tested negative. He couldn't find anybody in his past. I couldn't find anybody in mine. We just kind of let it go. And later I learned that this happens quite often, that people after 6, 7, 8, 10 years of marriage or a monogamous relationship, suddenly one person tests positive. And that's not unusual. It's unusual for you to hear about it, but it's not unusual in real life. And I started looking into a lot of things that I had never heard about that aren't so unusual in real life, but are very unusual to be exposed through AIDS organizations and the media. And in the brief time we have, I'd like to just share a few with those and then leave enough time for questions and answers. And I just want to point out to you that I'm not a doctor or a scientist. I was going to school to get my business degree when I was told that I had 5 to 7 years to live, which simple math tells you, you know, that's out the window. But I never completed that degree. It's been 12 years, as Earl said, since I've tested positive. I've never taken any AIDS medicines at all. I've never had a desire to after seeing so many people around me die. I think today we know that they're very toxic drugs. Back in 1992, when I was a public speaker, I wasn't allowed to use the word toxic when describing them. I was told that explicitly, do not use the word toxic, but today we say that openly, and I think that's a good thing that we're aware of this. These drugs cause all kinds of adverse effects ranging from fatigue, nausea, diarrhea, sleep disorders, psychotic behavior, bone death, diabetes, physical deformities, paralysis, muscle wasting, facial collapse, heart attacks and strokes, strokes in children as young as 6 years old. I mean, these drugs are devastating. And when people need to make a decision, and they do need, in my opinion, to make their own decision about taking them, because really today what you're risking is death from, supposed AIDS or death from drugs. Most people don't know this was happened at the last International AIDS Conference in Barcelona. It was announced by some researchers at the University of Pittsburgh, which is an esteemed research center, that the leading cause of death today among HIV-positive Americans is side effects, adverse effects from the drug therapies they take. That's the leading cause of death. It's no longer these illnesses classified as AIDS. But one of the things that I was very surprised to learn, and I feel a bit upset about, well, more than a bit upset, is I was told I was going to die based on a test that purports to say whether I have HIV infection through the detection of antibodies. I was very dismayed to learn that that test has no capacity to tell me if in fact the antibody response is specific to HIV. What those tests do, I found out, is they measure a person's blood's antibody response to a series of proteins that are thought to be associated with HIV. These proteins are found in normal, healthy people, in the placentas of healthy HIV-negative women, in dogs. I mean, these proteins are in all kinds of circumstances. They don't have anything specifically to do with HIV. And people who are in perfect health, in fine health, in normal health, and sometimes in poor health can test positive on these tests for no reason except these proteins are around in different people for different reasons. You can test positive because you've had certain vaccines. You can test positive if you have lupus or arthritis or certain forms of cancer. You can test positive because you have had Epstein's-Barr. You can test positive because of hepatitis. You can test positive because you're pregnant, which is something that I think women need to know about and very few women do. One of the first cross reactions that was noted on HIV antibody tests is pregnancy. The second thing that was noted was blood transfusions. So sometimes we wonder why people like Arthur Ashe tested positive after surgery in which he needed a blood transfusion. Elizabeth Glaser, another famous AIDS victim, tested positive after a massive blood transfusion. There's a disclaimer right on the test kits that said blood transfusion can cause a person to test positive in the absence of any other risk factors or exposure to HIV. The virus test I took, I found out, has a very interesting disclaimer line on it. It says this test is not intended to be used as a test to confirm the presence of HIV infection. Well, that's exactly what it's used for. I was told that that test could tell me whether or not I had the virus, and then I discovered years later there's actually a disclaimer right on there that's required by the FDA for legal purposes, because at a certain level they know that this test cannot tell us if the virus is there. It's very disturbing to me that I and so many people are told, you know, our lives are over to a certain degree. We must consider taking these very toxic drugs, that we can't get health insurance, life insurance. We may be barred from certain forms of work. We can't travel to certain countries. I mean, you know, it's pretty serious getting a positive test result. And I think on that same subject, another thing that I found very disturbing is that HIV antibody tests and this viral load test, any of the brands, have never been validated by the direct finding of HIV in any person who tests positive or who registers a viral load. What that means is that no scientist anywhere along the line from 1984, when it was announced that HIV was the probable cause of AIDS, bless you, until 1985 when these tests first became available, no scientist or researcher has ever done a very simple and necessary step, which is to validate these tests. To take, say, a group of 1,000 people who test positive and find out how many of those 1,000 people actually have the virus in their blood. If it's 1,000, well, then we have a 100% accurate test. If it's 999, then the test is 99.9% accurate. How many times have you heard the test is 99.9, 98.8% accurate? Those numbers are estimates and assumptions based on repeated testing with the same test or similar types of tests, or simply on estimates and assumptions that are derived mathematically that have nothing to do with the actual validation of the test. We have the means, we certainly have the funding, and there certainly is a compelling reason to validate these tests, yet that's never been done. And it's very disturbing to me on another level, because the difference between any one of these 28 or 29 conditions called AIDS and just having that condition is a positive HIV test. For example, cervical cancer is considered AIDS when it happens to a woman who tests HIV positive. I did some research into cervical cancer, and I figured as best I could, and I'll be safe about it, it looks like 98% of cervical cancer cases happen to women who are not HIV positive. So certainly we can't say, well, the majority of women with cervical cancer are positive, therefore it seems reasonable to say that when it happens to a woman who tests positive, it must be caused by, you know, this HIV. That's not the way it is. Yet when cervical cancer occurs in a woman who tests positive, that's called AIDS. Why? You know, that makes the test very important. And what's the difference between her cervical cancer and anyone else's? None. It's called AIDS, but it's not just a semantic difference. Women who have that diagnosis are often overtreated for their cancer to the detriment oftentimes of their lives and health, and are also told that they have to spend the rest of their life on these toxic so-called antiviral drugs. Having tuberculosis is having AIDS if you test positive. Having salmonella is having AIDS if you test positive. For anyone else, it's that they undercooked their chicken or, you know, didn't cook their eggs. There's lymphoma is considered an AIDS-defining illness in people who test positive, but not in those who don't. So the only distinction between AIDS and being anyone else in this world is this test. So much hinges on it. It's the very foundation for everything, yet there is none that can tell us if the virus is actually there. And this is not me saying this. This is the US FDA. This is the Food and Drug Administration telling us that. There's no test that can say if we even have specific antibodies. And if you look very carefully, which I hope you do, and I hope you will, there's no validation study ever published in the medical literature that tells us why it is that we assume that these tests are accurate and reliable and can be used to change the course of people's lives. Let's see, a few minutes here. I think another important thing that I would like to mention that I was very well, shocked to find out is that HIV doesn't make a particularly great candidate to explain the devastation of the immune system associated with AIDS. And I just want to make a point too. I know last week it was, I believe Darren Main was here. When we think of AIDS, we think of sickness, generally speaking, but most people don't know, and this is certainly not put forth very often in the media, and if it is, it's in that fine print. 50% of AIDS cases or more today in America since 1993, that's for the past 11 years, at least half of all people diagnosed with AIDS in this country for the past 11 years are not sick. Many of them are like Darren, HIV positive, extraordinarily healthy, perfectly healthy, normally healthy, no symptoms, no illness. They simply test positive and have a low T cell count. That is a T cell count that is at 200 or less, only one time. It only takes one test. And these laboratory tests can change in a given day. I have seen medical records of people whose blood is drawn once for a T cell count and sent out to 2 different labs, and one lab says they're healthy and fine, and the other says, oh, no, they got AIDS. I've seen the same thing happen with these so-called viral load tests, where the blood is drawn once, sent out to a couple different labs. This lab says they've got this devastatingly high viral load, which doesn't even really measure the virus. And this other one says, no, it's nothing significant right now. So, you know, all of this foundation, this groundwork that our concern and our fears and our education is based on, in my mind, is very questionable, and I hope you'll look into this. But what I wanted to say about the virus itself is that in 1984, a cancer researcher named Robert Gallo announced to the world through a media conference that he had found the probable cause of AIDS. Now, most medical and scientific news comes via published research papers, and then, you know, it comes out in the media after there's a paper that other doctors and scientists and researchers can look at. They can validate, they can refute, they can discuss the findings, but there's something there to base the news conference on. Dr. Gallo spoke before his work was published. And when it was published, it was not impressive in the least. I mean, to say that HIV caused AIDS, you would think that he had found evidence of HIV in every single one of the AIDS patients he studied. It was less than 50%. Less than half of the patients he studied had any evidence, and this is through antibody testing, not the finding of the actual virus, but through antibody testing or antigen testing, something that was a representative, that he considered a representative for that virus. Less than half. HIV as the cause of AIDS is also very interesting because Gallo and other scientists for over a decade had studied this class of viruses, retroviruses, as a potential cancer-causing virus. And one time it was thought that cancer was caused through sexually transmitted, blood-borne, infectious, contagious viruses. And our government spent a great deal of time and a great deal of money exploring that idea, and in doing so examined a class of viruses called retroviruses because they are non-cytotoxic. They don't kill cells. And when you have cancer, you have a lot of cell growth. You have rapid cell growth. You have cells proliferating. You can't have a virus that interferes with that process, and they thought that these viruses might actually stimulate or cause that process. So here's a virus that has no known cell-killing mechanisms, studied inside and out during the Great War on Cancer, the virus-cancer war. And suddenly, the scientist, a former cancer researcher, stands in front of the world and says, I've found the probable cause of AIDS. The same kind of virus he'd studied for many years that didn't cause cancer, but that didn't destroy cells. And in his paper, he had no explanation for how a retrovirus with no ability to kill cells could suddenly destroy the cells of the immune system. Why it was he concluded HIV was a probable cause of AIDS when less than half the AIDS patients he studied had any evidence of it. And we're still a couple weeks later, after his paper was published, came the news that a French researcher at the Pasteur Institute in France was accusing Robert Gallo of having stolen a cell culture that he had sent Gallo some weeks before that he thought might have some answers in it with regard to what was causing AIDS, and this guy was also a retrovirologist. It turned out Gallo hadn't discovered anything. He opened his mail and took this guy's cell culture and claimed it as his own for the very reason that he couldn't find evidence of HIV in his AIDS patients. So he ended up just swiping this guy's cell culture and claiming it as his own, going out and registering after his press conference an antibody test in his name. It was later negotiated between the French and American governments that the two scientists should share the patent rights for that HIV test and for the credit for the discovering of HIV. And then you notice, if you will, that every year Nobel Prizes are given to innovators and researchers and people who've made great contributions in this world. In the 20 years that we've had AIDS going, no one has ever awarded a Nobel Prize to either of those guys, and I think that's kind of interesting. That the scientist who supposedly discovered what is alleged to be the greatest plague of our modern time has no recognition and was belatedly entered into the National Academy of Sciences even. But we just have, this brief period of time, and I know Dr. Geschecter has spoken to you about AIDS in Africa, and I'm sure he's brought up the fact that here we rely on a positive HIV test to say someone with lymphoma has AIDS. In Africa, no HIV test is necessary to say someone has AIDS. And so you have people who are being diagnosed based on a series of symptoms that are rather nonspecific and can be caused by anything from malnutrition to unclean water to the ravages of civil war and not being able to live in a normal way. Those symptoms that arise from those conditions can be called AIDS without any kind of HIV test, whereas here the HIV test is required to say one has AIDS. So when we think of this as a global problem, it's very different from country to country. And up until the time that I wrote my book, I was trying to write a little pamphlet, which I have here today if anybody wants to take one with them. It has the website address for the organization I run, Alive and Well AIDS Alternatives, and some basic information and resources to learn more. When I wrote this book, this was published in 2000, Canada had not adopted the United States definition of AIDS with regard to T-cell counts. That is, in 1993, we said that people who are well but have a low T-cell count and test positive are now classified as AIDS cases, and that's where the majority of our AIDS cases come from. It's very interesting to me that a person diagnosed with AIDS with that criteria could simply move to Toronto or Manitoba and no longer have AIDS. Most people don't know, too, with regard to international standards, it's not just that way for AIDS, but also with HIV tests. There's no standard for reading what is a positive or what is a negative result. Not from country to country, and not even from lab to lab, and not even from government agency to government agency. The FDA has a different standard from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, which is different from the Red Cross, which is very different from the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense has the highest standard for testing HIV positive. They require more reaction, more proteins reactions that test positive in a more significant way than anyone else because they don't want to turn away people who want to join the military. Whereas the blood banks, it's a lower criterion because they want to be very careful to make sure the blood supply doesn't have anything in it that might harm people. So, if you think of HIV tests as a yes or no, a black or white, it's not that way at all. And there's so many things that I learned because thankfully I had enough of an open mind and perhaps even an open heart, because this is an issue that many of us take, to our heart. When we're in favor of, AIDS and AIDS research, when there's these walks and dances and bike rides, I've done those too. I wouldn't do them now. But, we feel like we're embracing, people who are suffering around the world. We're embracing people that are different from us, perhaps. We're embracing people that need our love and concern and care and dollars. It's hard to look at this with, a new set of eyes and to examine this information in a new way. But I encourage you to do so. Because for me and many people like me, and there are many people like me, the media just doesn't tell you about us. We are here from Arkansas to Zambia. We are, parents. We have beautiful, healthy kids. I have 2 kids, ages 6 and 2. All I have to do is tell people at ages 6 and 2 they've never had an ear infection, they've never had an upper respiratory tract infection, they've never had strep, they've never had bronchitis, they've never had the flu. I mean, my kids are so healthy. We see 3 separate pediatricians, so no one can say anything about that being just my opinion, and no one can threaten me. Because another thing that you guys don't know about is that mothers and parents who test positive, if they make an informed choice to forego treatment with these drugs that are very, very toxic, they can lose custody of their children. They can be deemed by doctors and social authorities as in denial, irresponsible, and unfit for that decision, to not go along with the status quo, to not follow the mainstream, and they can lose custody of their kids. And not even just little kids. I had brought, but we ran out of copies last night, an article from a paper perhaps you might consider. Yeah, you can print it out. It's called Dissident Moms. It's about some work that I'm doing with mothers around the world who are facing this situation of being told that they're unfit and irresponsible because they make a decision that differs from the AIDS mainstream and the medical mainstream to forego these toxic drugs during pregnancy, or for kids who are healthy, but that doctors seem to think, must have a compelling need for these drugs. They have their children taken away. And one woman, and then I'll stop after I tell you this because it's just so incredible, she was hospitalized for a lung infection. Now you think lung infection, she's HIV positive, of course, that must be AIDS. Well, she had had dental surgery. And she had a bad reaction to penicillin, so she quit taking it, and she couldn't get through at her dentist because it was the holidays, and her kids wanted to go to Six Flags. So she took her kids to Six Flags and went up and down on this high thing, and next thing you know, the infection creeped down into her lungs, and she got a lung infection due to her dental surgery, and her lung collapsed, probably from the up and down ride. She ended up in the hospital, and the doctors assumed immediately that she had AIDS-defining pneumonia. And they proceeded to treat her as if she did without even verifying that, which can be dangerous because the drugs that they give for that can be devastating. They can even cause death. So they put her on that drug, and when she raised objections to that strategy, they were upset by that. And then she admitted to them that she wasn't taking any AIDS drugs, though she had tested positive like 19 years ago. And they were very upset by that. So upset that they badgered her and tried to coerce her into taking them. She refused. They sent in a psychiatrist to evaluate her and try to declare her mentally unfit. And the suggestion was that if she were mentally unfit, they would be taking away her kids. And finally, she kept butting heads with this one doctor. And this is a very polite woman, by the way, very soft-spoken, nice lady who just was, she had her convictions about this. The doctor ordered that she be put in ankle restraints and strapped to her bed, like some kind of, wild lunatic. This is in the year 2004 in a big hospital in Dallas, Texas, that this happens. I mean, there's a whole world of stuff out there that we never hear about. And I really encourage you, through Alive and Well's website, through information that Professor Agar may have, through the other speakers that were here and what they introduced to you, to look into this. Because I think those of us who test positive deserve it, and just humanity, we all deserve to know what's going on, because I think this affects all of our lives in many, many ways. From tax dollars to where our heart is, it affects us all. So I encourage you to do that, and I really thank you for your attention this morning, and now I'd be happy to answer any questions in the best way I can. So thank you.
Average life expectancy of somebody who tests positive for HIV but doesn't take medications versus somebody who tests positive and does take medications?
That would be so great to know, and you know what? No one is doing any studies on that to find out. In 20 years, there hasn't been a single study that has attempted to quantify how many people there are like me who test HIV positive and who elect not to take the medicines, or to qualify what it is that we do that might be what is the formula for our success. It's never been done, so we don't know. I can tell you from my personal experience working in this area for a number of years that the people I have seen who are diagnosed positive that are no longer here, sadly to say that includes a great number of my friends, were people who made very different choices, either knowingly or unknowingly, from what I've made. I've lived a healthy life, and I stick to a very healthy diet. I got scared into it, frankly, when I tested positive, because in '92 they didn't push you on the medications if you were positive and you weren't sick, like they do today. They tell you start taking the drugs now before you get sick. And interestingly, most positives who become ill, like 85%, become ill only after starting the drug treatments. So I had to forge my own way, I thought. So I did a lot of research into vitamins, minerals, and supplements and healthy diets, and I changed the way I was living. And I'm really glad. I think that if everybody did that, we'd all probably be a lot healthier. But I don't think I'm doing anything particularly special, and a lot of people who test positive aren't either. But those who succumb either to the fear, some people were involved or become involved in drugs and alcohol because they're so devastated by that diagnosis. They live with a sense of hopelessness and fear and stress. Other people are death by doctors, and not with AIDS drugs. There was a woman who had cervical cancer who didn't want to take the AIDS drug. She had tested positive. They gave her an extra special jumbo dose of the therapies, which killed her. And I've seen that happen a number of times. It's kind of a medical prejudice that if somebody's not going to take the AIDS drugs, you need to give them, you know, something more to get rid of what other people have and can get over just fine with standard treatments. So that may take someone's life. There's a number of reasons why people don't make it out alive, and I think it's interesting the way you phrased your question, because I think the biggest question is, you know, isn't it amazing that there are any HIV positives who choose not to take the drugs that manage to remain well in a world that has no place for us? There's no place for me in scientific studies. There's no place for me in textbooks or the media. There's no honor for me at AIDS organizations. People like me are actually turned down from AIDS organizations as healthy HIV positives who are not taking the drugs, who are doing things like lead productive, normal lives and having healthy families. You'd think we'd be a bit of welcome good news. We're routinely told we send the wrong message. Gee, sorry. You know, what's the message? It's only good news if it's bad news? You know, it's only good news if we're, you know, filling prescriptions? So, you know, we don't know. And that's a really great question that I hope in the future will be answered. Our organization is constantly seeking funding to carry out that kind of work. So I hope it will be done. Yes?
The tests that you had done, were either one of them Western blots or were they both ELISA?
I've had probably, I don't know, 14 tests. I've had ELISAs, I've had a Western blots, I've had viral loads, qualitative and quantitative. I don't think I've ever had a rapid test. I think that's the only kind I've missed in my repertoire of HIV testing experience. What's interesting about the newer tests, these rapid tests, is they make more declarative statements about their inability to tell us much. They're actually approved as preliminary tests that have to be validated with other tests that take longer than 20 minutes, which is weird because the whole reason to take a rapid test is to get a result in 20 minutes. But if you read the fine print and talk to the test manufacturers, they will tell you a positive doesn't count unless it's been validated by another test that takes, you know, several days. And a negative doesn't count as long as you feel that you've had a risk exposure. Well, why the heck would you take the test if you weren't concerned that maybe you've had a risk somewhere along the way? So no matter which way it goes, you can't get a definitive result, if there is such a thing, in 20 minutes anyway. And then the disclaimers on these tests are very interesting because they used to say on the test kits in this fine print, HIV, comma, the virus that causes AIDS. Then last, I think it was November, they approved a test that said, that in the literature said HIV, comma, the virus thought to cause AIDS. Not proven, not demonstrated, not known, but thought to cause AIDS. Then in June of last year, they approved a test, and this one says HIV, comma, the virus correlated with AIDS. So it sounds like there's just this, you know, very gentle backstepping from this notion that we know HIV causes AIDS. And that kind of came at the same time as a big article published in a science publication, Nature Medicine, a 20-year retrospective of AIDS science that began with a kind of a tacit admission that after 20 years and $150 billion, scientists today are still using two educated guesses to try to explain how HIV might cause AIDS. You know, gee, and we have the impression that's also certain. But yeah, I've taken all those tests. And yeah, I've come up, interestingly, when I had my positive, my negative, and my indeterminate, it was the same lab on different days. So I always thought that was pretty interesting. Any other questions? Yes?
Last night you were talking about how you're trying to get a debate together.
Yeah.
Has there been a debate over, like a major debate at all over the issue?
Well, it depends on what you consider major. I was invited to the University of Pittsburgh, where they have that, you know, pretty esteemed research center, by their Department of Communications to do a debate with one of their resident AIDS researchers. Which, you know, by the way, I started doing this, first of all, to try to share with people, you know, all the mainstream stuff about HIV and AIDS from the perspective that I was dying. Then I started doing it when I found out there were these questions to see, what would happen if I said it out loud? Because I couldn't get a debate going on between doctors and scientists. So I thought, well, I'm just going to start saying this, and I'm going to start a website, and I'm going to put out a book, and I'm going to get a discussion going. And if I'm wrong, I'm going to find out. I'm going to find out in a big way. I'm going to be really embarrassed, and I'll have to apologize to everybody. At least I will have found out, And I always approach it from that. So when I went to do this debate in Pittsburgh, I was perfectly prepared to be shut down by their researchers. Again, I'm a high school graduate with a few years of business school. That's it. And these guys are like the best and the brightest. None of them would debate me. None of them at the University of Pittsburgh would debate me. It was amazing. So they brought in, I don't know if they considered me so lowly that they wouldn't even be in the same room with me or what. So they flew in an AIDS researcher from Los Alamos in New Mexico to debate with me. And when we had a debate, and the entire transcript of that is at our website, aliveandwell.org. So if you wanted to, you could read that and make your own conclusions. I feel that I held up my own, and his statement to me at the end was interesting because he said, "You had it so easy." And I thought, gee, that's interesting. I'm going against 20 years of conventional wisdom, and I have it so easy. And then he also told me, he said, I have that validation study. I have that back at my lab, that study that shows HIV tests have been validated. I didn't want to embarrass you today in front of everybody here. And I didn't want to show you this because then you would know, Christine, that you're going to die. And I would feel really bad about that because you're a nice person, and maybe it's your denial that's keeping you alive. I love that when people are trying to protect my delusional nature. And he said, but when I get back, I'm going to send you that. It's been, 3 years. I've quit asking him about it because when I did, he got really testy. And that same thing happened just recently. We had a smaller debate. I did what's called a pre-interview for Bill Maher's new show, Real Time. He had that show, Politically Incorrect. And I debated a prominent AIDS doctor named Dr. Jeffrey Galpin. And he said he had that same study. And he made some other claims too. And later, after we finished, I said, here's my FedEx number. I want you to FedEx these to me because I really want to see them. Because if you're right, I will, rent a public forum, rip up my book, close down my website, apologize, and get a new hobby, gardening. I don't know. I'll do that. Please send those to me. And I made sure that Bill Maher and his staff, knew that this exchange would happen, so they could consider that when considering this topic for their program. It's been a month, and finally he said there will be no information exchange. Gosh. If you have something that proves someone who's saying things that fly in the face of convention wrong, don't you have a civic duty to make that known, to share that? I mean, why wouldn't somebody try to make me stop? It's been said I share dangerous information, that I'm getting young people to think. If that can be stopped so easily with a few studies, there's another study that I urge you to look for that you will not find, I'm sure, and I would be very grateful if you did find that and if you would send it to me. That is a study that shows electron microscopic evidence of HIV isolation. The first one to appear in the published literature was 13 years after Dr. Robert Gallo said he discovered AIDS, the AIDS virus, HIV. 13 years later, somebody publishes some evidence of what's supposed to be an HIV isolation. But if you see this, you can see that it doesn't fit a criteria for isolation. Isolation means everything else aside. When you're isolated, you're alone. You're by yourself. And this is some stuff that's circled in a cell culture amidst a bunch of contaminants, a bunch of cellular debris, a bunch of particles. And the stuff that's circled and optimistically labeled HIV doesn't fit the accepted shape or size of retroviruses. And that's the best microscopic evidence so far in a photographic sense of an HIV isolate. If you can find it, I would love to see it, and so would many doctors and researchers around the world. And also, you could win $100,000. There's an organization in England that has a $100,000 reward for anyone who can bring that forth. And I found that very interesting, too. I mean, certainly our AIDS researchers make, handsome salaries, but, who couldn't use an extra $100,000? Gee, car, vacation, I don't know. So, any other questions? We have about 15 more minutes here, maybe 10?
About 5.
5.
Do you have any really good people for what your CD4 count really is?
No. I haven't done a CD4 count since 1994. I made an executive decision to stop doing that because I looked into why I was, living or dying in my head based on those numbers. And frankly, every time I get a T-cell count done, I would crash my car. I would be so nervous, so frightened at the thought that these numbers were going to say whether I was living or dying, which direction I was headed, up or down. I couldn't keep my mind on anything, and I became a serial rear-ender. I rear-ended 3 different people, not on the same day, mind you, but the stress was unbelievable. So I looked into why am I doing this? What studies are there? There's never been a study comparing HIV positive and HIV negative hemophiliacs with regard to T cells. There's never been a study comparing HIV positive and HIV negative IV drug users. I'm naming AIDS risk groups here. With regard to T cells, there's never been a study comparing HIV positive and HIV negative gay men with a history of recreational drug use and sexually transmitted diseases. There haven't been enough studies to make it worth it to me to go out and get so freaked out and upset. And one day I was driving home from those T cell counts and I was on the 405 freeway, which is a very busy freeway, and I looked around and I thought, there is no one else that I can see anywhere who's doing their T cell counts and driving themselves nuts. I'm just going to stop doing this because there doesn't seem to be a good scientific reason. It's really, upsetting to me on a lot of levels. I've thought of doing it now just to be able to talk about it, but it's very expensive to keep up with it. And frankly, I hate blood tests. But if I had enough money and if I had a little more courage, which I could probably muster up if I had the money, I think I would do that regularly. I'd probably do that once a month along with viral load tests, just so I could be, a human experiment and say, hey, does this add up? Because I've had, when I was doing my T cell counts, very high T cell counts and lower, no difference in my health. Viral load counts that were off the charts back in 1996. I actually had a viral load test that quite literally went off the chart for the highest number on the FDA approval studies for the new drugs that came out whose efficacy was measured through their ability to change those viral load numbers. Off the chart, I was fine. 3 weeks later, I did another viral load test. My viral load went from 359,000 to 980, which would be, if I was, if I had taken some kind of drug and it was part of a study, they would say, this is it, this is the drug, look at what happened. But I wasn't. All I did was drive to San Diego twice for testing. Maybe that, lowers viral load. Taking that 405 freeway, I don't know. It's a pretty miraculous place. But I don't even remember what the original question was. T-cell counts. No, I don't do them. And as a matter of fact, at Alive and Well, we have something interesting because we provide a forum, as best we can with our limited funding, for ideas that go outside the mainstream, that don't get acknowledged by the media. And one of the things we have is support services for people who are questioning this T-cell information. It's called the 200 Club. It's for HIV positives who have a T-cell count of 200 or less and are like Darren. They're healthy, they're fine. I mean, Darren is a yoga instructor, a rock climber. I mean, you wish you were as fit as Darren. He can, have one foot on his head and brush his teeth from over here. I mean, he's amazing. And he's got AIDS. He's got an AIDS diagnosis based on T-cell count. So we have this 200 Club for people who want to share their stories with each other, because certainly, we don't hear it anywhere else. So we encourage people to make up their own minds about T-cell counts, about testing, about drug therapies. Just make up your own minds. We don't say do it, don't do it. We say make up your own minds, because you are the one who lives with the results of your decisions.
This might actually be to Terry. I don't know if you know, most things in biology exist on a bell curve. If we have normal people who are not infected with anything, what are the two tails on CD4 counts? What's low normal and high normal? Do you know? Has that been done?
Yeah, 1,000 to 1,200 is normally considered normal.
1,200? Well, that's normal. That's where most people are.
For black women.
And so the tail down below, low normal.
With seriously ill AIDS patients, it's often below 50.
No, I mean in normal people. If we did
Oh,
everybody
thanks,
here,
Bill.
what kind of a range would we have?
I don't know. I don't think I've ever seen the figures.
Okay, see, that's what I'm wondering about. I'm just wondering if the seriously ill AIDS people who have really low counts, how that compares to the normal curve for
I
people
would
who are.
assume it would vary. It's like 1,200 plus or minus 400.
Well,
I mean,
I've tried to find that, and what I do is when I'm looking for something, as I put it out in venues that reach people who are critics of those of us who raise questions about AIDS, and I say, I'm looking for a study that shows what T-cell counts are in the general population over time. What are T-cell counts in premenopausal and postmenopausal women? What are T-cell counts in people as they grow older? What are T-cell counts in people who are being treated for cancer? What are T-cell counts in people who are HIV negative and have the flu? You know, what are T-cell counts in general in a wide array of circumstances? And this one guy in Australia who's a medical student said, oh, I have those, No, he didn't. He kept sending me things, and I'd read the study, and finally, you know, there was nothing, none of that data. And that's another thing that's really interesting to me, is you will find at the National Institutes of Health what is supposed to be a rebuttal to people who question mainstream information about HIV and AIDS. It's very carefully constructed and written in a way, it seems like it's a PR firm that wrote it, and it's anonymously authored, which is unusual for a scientific paper. Usually you know who the author is, where they come from, or they, you know, what university or institution they're associated with, and they have to declare any competing interests when they publish. There's not even an author on this paper. And it purports to lay to rest these outstanding questions. And it cites studies, and it seems very credible. But if you look at the studies, what you see is there's no substantiation within the study for the claims that are being made on that document. And because I'm a mother with 2 kids, because I'm not a doctor or a scientist, I finally hired a science correspondent who used to work for the London Sunday Times. I got some grant money to do this, to write a rebuttal to the rebuttal. And I hope to have that up at our new website in the next couple months, hopefully by late spring or early summer. And I think that will prove an interesting document, because this one put out by the government is the government's best shot at saying, don't listen to that point of view. It's wrong. It's been discounted. It's been, you know, explained away. And I know that we can rebut that very, very effectively.
Many people have other classes, so we're finished now.